Welcome to the world of Dungeons and Dragons. You may have clicked on this video because you wanted to know more about D&D, or if you were sent this video randomly by a relative that is currently obsessed with it. Personally, I made this video to help my girlfriend's parents know what I do for a living. So after you familiarize yourself with Dungeons and Dragons and get obsessed with the hobby like so many before you, you too can send this to your mother who still thinks the game is for unsocial basement dwellers. Starting with the most general and slowly getting more and more specific, we start with, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Well, shortened to D&D, it is a tabletop role-playing game, also shortened to ttrpg. This genre loves acronyms, but to have a tabletop role-playing game, you need rules, imagination, story, and dice. Rules are important because many kids, when they were younger, loved to play pretend, but often could lead to arguments on who actually owns the playhouse, or if one kid actually shot the other one with their pretend laser pistols. So, as adults, we have rules to make it fair. Our imagination takes the form of improv, which is a form of theater that individuals are given a scenario without a script, and they act out a scene that they make up on the spot. And while not as much skill is required in a tabletop game, the concept is similar. People around the table bounce off each other to create a story together. But we do need someone creating that scenario or story to play with. And that falls on the shoulder of the game master or dungeon master for D&D players. The dungeon master or DM is the facilitator of the rules, but not the narrator. They play every character that are not the players. Their job is to guide the narrative and by extension the game to fun and satisfying beats, because the dice provides the unpredictable element of the game, used to determine outcomes of choices made by the players. The most common dice used in D&D is the 20-sided die, also called the D20. So let's give you an example. In a Dungeons and Dragons game, the players might be given a scenario that they are in a tavern. Each player decides what they want to do in the tavern. Some say that they want to flirt with the bartender. Another might start betting on a game of poker. And another might be trying to get as drunk as possible on the ale provided. However, the dungeon master knows that there is a group of goblins in the basement stealing all the ale. So he tells another player that they hear some quiet thuds coming from somewhere. Each player would roll the dice to determine how successful they were. The lower the number, the less likely they are to succeed. The higher the number, the more likely they are. So let's say the player who flirted with the bartender rolled a 4 on their D20, and the DM describes them being slapped by the bartender having failed that interaction. The one betting on poker rolls an 18, so they walk away with a handful of gold. The player who heard the thumps wants to investigate, obviously, and wants to see the source of the sound. So they roll a 12. Barely enough to figure out that it was coming from the door to the basement, but not high enough to intuit what is behind that door. At that point, the players may choose to further investigate the basement or go about their other activities. But going down into the basement, a fight may commence, and the DM puts down a map of the area or the dungeon, and the players move their figures representing their character around the map to strategically fight the monsters. Some games play with a simple dry erase map to draw rooms on, others invest in much more elaborate setups for maps. But the result is the same, players rolling the dice to see if they hit the creatures with their weapons and how much damage they dealt to them. But we will get to the actual rules of the game later in the video. But if they did fight the goblins, they will eventually find that goblins all over the country are stealing ale for a gigantic ale-powered superweapon of a powerful wizard who has their own dark ambitions. The players find themselves thrust into a fantastical story of magic and high stakes, not unlike The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or similar fantasy. Because that's the whole purpose of Dungeons and Dragons, creating a collaborative and memorable story with your friends. It becomes an exploration of character beyond who we are, getting to peer into perspectives and make choices that we wouldn't otherwise be able to make. I can't remember what happened the night that we played Uno, no shade to that game, but me and my friends will still talk about the night that we liberated an island from a mind-controlling sea beast. Because of that, it is also an escape. And some might argue a more interactive and beneficial escape than video games or movies can be. But most of all, it is fun. And that is why so many people have fallen in love with the unique game. Even beyond that, it's become part of culture. It has been a popular tool in therapy even, to help teach social skills in a controlled environment. It also helps to improve focus, build self-confidence, improve mental health, learn cooperation, problem-solving skills, leadership skills, risk assessment, and even math skills with having to add together modifier bonuses and dice rolls. People everywhere can learn the rules of the game and play with their friends by getting the player's handbook, the Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide. The player's handbook containing character options and tropes and races that we'll talk about more later in the video, and the Monster Manual that gives stat blocks or information about monsters like goblins or beholders. And then the Dungeon Master's Guide to help the Dungeon Master create the story and narrative for your players. Or you can get the starter set, which will give you everything that you need to run a couple sessions at first. These all help you get started with the basics in a high fantasy type of story. However, you can also buy other books that do a lot of the work for you. The DM can obviously make up the entire world in their head, or get Rime of the Frostmaiden book that gives them a whole story up in the Arctic ice to play in. It gives them dungeons to explore, items to find, specific ice monsters to fight, and towns to visit. Similarly, you can buy Descent into Avernus for a game set in the first layer of Hell. Or you can get Spelljammer for an adventure in space, much like Treasure Planet. Or a magical school like Harry Potter with the Strixhaven book. But you also have books that expand the rules of the game and add unique and interesting elements. Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything provide extra races and character options for players. Dungeons & Dragons is on its 5th iteration the time of making this video. Technically 6, but that's not important. But it's had many iterations or evolutions of the game since its start in 1974. And as of the recording of this video, they are currently working on the next evolution of the game nicknamed 1D&D, where they are currently tweaking the rules to make it more streamlined and easier to understand for newcomers. But alas, some good news. If you have neither friends or money, most local game shops hold events that you can join, or an open floor where anyone can come in and play on a specific night. These events are usually called Adventures League, where they have their own program for the specific purpose of introducing new people to the game. Call your local game store and see if they are hosting any games. There's also Facebook groups that are always looking for games to join. From my experience, they are basically a Facebook group for every region in the United States and beyond. So join a group and post that you're looking for one. Or use websites like startplaying.games to join seats of online games. With the rise of technology and the rise of COVID and social distancing, those who have still wanted to play with friends have resorted to playing over webcam. Other internet aids have popped up like D&D Beyond that automates a lot of character creation and dice rolls. Now people can get all of their books digitally in their database and automatically have access to all of the content with just a click of the search bar. Though it may require a subscription if you want some sort of content sharing features with your group of friends. There's also online tools to make dungeon maps like Incarnate, Dungeon Craft, or Dungeon Fog, and then virtual tabletops where people can plug in the maps that you make and use tokens instead of figures like Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, or Owlbear Rodeo, my personal favorite. Other resources may provide sound effects, ambient music, and world building. Just depends on how much you want to get into it, but the purpose of the game remains the same: to have fun with your friends and create an excuse to see each other and make memories. Since its beginnings almost 40 years ago now, Dungeons & Dragons has grown into its own superpower, influencing media, creating toy lines, and becoming very mainstream. But it all kind of started with a show called Critical Role back in 2015. The first ever filmed and streamed D&D game for others to view and enjoy. They thought that no one would want to watch others play a tabletop game, and yet 7 years later, it has a net worth of over $17 million, their own toys, comic books, novels, and streamed TV show. And they still stream their game, currently on their 3rd campaign. Dungeons & Dragons has also inspired video games, and because of the rules-based system, it is easily converted into the rules of a video game and played very similarly, with popular games like Divinity: Original Sin and Dungeons & Dragons: Dark Alliance, and then the most recent game, Baldur's Gate: Descent into Avernus. We get to play a game online with basically the exact same rules as the game we play at the table, much to the enjoyment of those who love both Dungeons & Dragons and video games alike. For those who like board games, we now have a D&D inspired Monopoly, Clue, or Adventure Begins, which is basically D&D but more board game than tabletop role-playing game. You can even find elements of D&D in games like Munchkin or Heroescape. On the movie side of things, there have been many Dungeons & Dragons movies that have tried to be successful but unfortunately have fallen flat in popularity. However, much more popular films and shows have included Dungeons & Dragons in their plotline, such as Stranger Things, and they have done most in boosting the popularity of the game, their villain Vecna already being a very popular D&D figure. Everyone sees a show and then wants to play the game, so now they're playing. But now, the owners of Dungeons & Dragons are trying again with a new movie, Honor Among Thieves, coming next March. This time starring the one and only Chris Pine, among other very popular actors. The game has also inspired movies like Disney's Onward, TV shows like Disenchantment, and then have been highlighted in other shows like Community, The Big Bang Theory. Everyone just wants a piece of D&D. Even recently, Pokemon, who has, in my opinion, recently created a Pokemon based on the Mimic, which is a very iconic monster in Dungeons & Dragons. This surge of popularity has also inspired other third-party creators, or people who don't own Dungeons & Dragons, who are able to make content for the game because of an open gaming license that the owners of D&D have released. That means people of no affiliation can write books, add rules, and create character options, and then benefit financially for it. So if there isn't an official book for playing D&D game in heaven instead of hell, well, someone can create it and release it online for people to buy. This kind of content we lovingly call homebrew, as it's brewed at home. Now, there are some full-blown companies that profit off of this perk, like Ghostfire Gaming or Kobold Press, that create this homebrew, but there are also websites like the DM's Guild and ttrpg that are available for everyone and anyone to create and upload their own content. This brings us to what I do. With the ever-expanding D&D community, I, among so many other YouTubers, make videos on the game. It might be simply how to play tutorials, cool monster highlights, or what kind of cool characters that you can make, or how to make your favorite anime character in D&D, videos on other people's stories of the game, mini painting, reviews of these homebrew content that comes out, homebrew that they do themselves, as well as videos on D&D news and recent releases, or streaming their own games like Critical Role. I personally focus on helping people stretch their creativity when it comes to characters and world building. World building being the dungeon master creating the worlds where the players play in. Remember, the settings. I explore how we can use the rules of D&D to do different things than otherwise intended, creating unique narratives and impactful worlds. If you end up liking my videos, go ahead and subscribe to keep up with me and my YouTube journey. YouTubers make money through YouTube ads, sponsorships, memberships, and Patreon, which is the most popular of what I've seen. A monthly subscription for bonus content, access to communities, and behind-the-scenes looks, among other things. But some people just subscribe to support. Personally, I have a monthly magazine of homebrew content and creativity tips that aid towards certain themes of the game, whether it be space, the undead, or weather, to name one of my most recent. I also provide opportunities to help me with the content that I make, special recognition in videos, one-on-one time with me and helping you with your games, and I'm about to upload recordings of my home games that certain tiers on my Patreon can enjoy as well. Other ways people have made D&D into an income is being a DM and charging people to play in their games, either being in person at the local game shops or online on the website that I mentioned earlier, stopplaying.games. I personally have done this before, but not my current focus. In return for paying these DMs, you will get a well-prepared adventure and consistency that you may not find at a more casual table. And of course, there are reviews, just like your average Uber or Airbnb. But now let's get into how the game actually works. What are the rules to the game? Well, it starts out with the creation of your character. In a fantasy realm, you have classic tropes like the barbarian, a fighter that fuels themselves with a berserking rage, a bard who magically influences others with song, stories, or dance, a cleric who channels divine healing magic from a god that they worship, a druid that wields the magic of nature, plants, and animals, a fighter who is your classic sword and shield knights, monks that are ones that fight with their hands and channel the inner chi or ki, depending on how you pronounce it. Paladins have learned to channel their divine magic into the sword to smite evil. Rangers are good at navigation, travel, and ranged attacks. Rogues are akin to thieves who sneak and steal. Sorcerers are born with magic innate in their blood, while warlocks get their magic through making deals with devils and other dark entities. Wizards learn magic through books and study, and the artificer tinkers and creates robotic contraptions and alchemical concoctions. A player will choose one of these characters to play with in the game, and then they choose their race or species. And there are many options here as well. You may be familiar with the races of elf, dwarf, or halfling, but there are also dragonborn, partial dragons, tieflings, partial demons, and animal folk, like the tabaxi or herongon. So you can imagine a wizard elf or a barbarian dragonborn. Once the player knows that they want to play, they fill out this thing called a character sheet. Here is all the information that you compile for your character when you create them. It looks overwhelming, but we will go over it briefly. Here we have our class, race, and background, or backstory, that we have chosen for our character, and alignment, which basically whether the character is good, evil, lawful, or chaotic in personality. Then we fill in our modifiers, which are certain areas where the player must choose their character to be naturally adept in, having certain points that you can assign to them. Strength is how strong your character is, dexterity is how acrobatic your character is, constitution is how much they can withstand attacks and ill effects, intelligence is how smart the character is, wisdom is how intuitive your character is, and charisma is how social that your character is. The higher the number, the more bonuses they get when they roll for outcomes in that category. For the more specific skills, you see a list on the right. These get bonuses from the associated modifier on the left, as well as extra proficiency bonuses if the player chooses to specifically excel in that department. It looks like this fighter prioritized being good at strength, constitution, and charisma, and chose to be proficient in the athletics, history, perception, and persuasion skills. Meaning if we took that 4 the player rolled to flirt with the bartender before, it might have been a 6 if the player was telling them an elaborate lie, being more deceptive. Or it could have been an 8, adding 4 plus 4, if the interaction was more persuasive. The saving throws above we will get to in a moment. But at the bottom, we have other proficiencies or armor and weapon types that the character can wield and wear, languages that they speak, and possible other details of your character. Next, we look at the armor class, which is the defense of your character. An enemy has to roll their dice and get at least a 17 in this case in order to hit you. Initiative determines the player's turn in order when they get into a fight. The higher the number, the more likely they will go first. Speed is how far that they can go within one turn in a fight. Hit points is how much damage that you can take before getting knocked out. Hit dice is the dice that you use when you rest in order to heal yourself. And death saves is when you're knocked out but not immediately healed by a party member, and you have to roll every turn to see if you die. If you roll above a 10, it's a success. Below a 10, failure. 3 successes, you wake up, and 3 failures, you're dead. The next 2 areas hold your inventory, including the weapons that you wield and the gold that you have, your money, essentially. Your attack bonus is added to your dice when you roll to see if you hit someone with your weapon, and then the damage is what you roll to then take off of the number of hit points the enemy has. You roll a d6 or 6-sided die and then add 3 to it in this case. So if you roll a 2, add 3, you deal 5 points of damage to the enemy. This area is to help in roleplay, or the improv area of the game, to help you know what kind of decisions your character would make. So because a personality trait reads, "My flattery makes those I talk to feel wonderful and important," it might be why they chose to go flirt with the bartender in the first place. And then finally, here is where they put the other features that they get because of their background, race, or class that they choose. Because they are a fighter, they get the second wind and fighting style. And then because they are also a noble, they get a position of privilege. But as they level up, they will get more features to play with. Now, if you are a spellcaster like a wizard or sorcerer, you may also have access to spells. You have the name of the spell, how far you can cast it, and any components it takes. The V stands for verbal, meaning that you have to speak the spell. S for somatic means you have to wave your hands to cast a spell. And M, meaning materials, is an object that you need to channel the spell. The description of the spell and what happens if you cast it at a more powerful level. There are some spells that spellcasters can cast all day and not get tired. And then other spells of levels that they can only cast so many times in a day. Meaning that out of this list, they have 4 slots to cast any of them. They may choose to cast 1 spell 4 times or 4 spells each once, but no more. Or they can choose to cast a spell at a higher level and cast it with a slot in a tier above. There are 9 tiers of spells that you can gain access to as you level up. At some point in the story, also called a campaign, they may get access to magic items that also give them abilities to play with. You have the weapon type, the rarity, and the description of what the item does. Some items might be really good for melee-focused characters, others might be really good for spellcasters. On the Dungeon Master side, obviously the players will at some point fight goblins. So does the Dungeon Master create goblin characters too? No, they use pre-generated stat blocks. You still have similar things like their alignment, armor class, hit points, speed, modifiers, and skills they may be proficient in. We also see that the goblin can see really well in the dark, their languages, and how difficult the monster is. The higher this number, the harder the creature tends to be. You also get experience points for defeating it, and if you gain enough, you level up. But most tables, in my experience, don't keep track of this experience and just level up after they get to certain arcs of the story. Finally, we have special abilities it may have and the attacks that it can make on its turn. Now, some monsters may have attacks that instead of them rolling to hit, the players roll to avoid. Like this war priest casting holy fire, they have to roll a wisdom saving throw to avoid damage and being blinded. If we look back on our character sheet, we see our saving throws where we skip the first time and see our fighter gets a +1 to this saving throw. Not great, but it could be worse. You may have seen some popular D&D monsters like the Mimic, Beholder, Gelatinous Cube, or of course, the Dragon. On a D&D map, each square usually represents a 5-foot square, meaning if a player has a 30-foot walking speed, they can go 6 squares on their turn. If they cast a spell like Wall of Thorns with a range of 120 feet, that means you can cast a spell up to 24 squares away. We use miniature game pieces often representing the character we are playing, or we use whatever we can find around the house. A big part of the hobby is both 3D printing these miniatures, which sometimes aren't very miniature, as well as painting them to very detailed creatures. Many make their livelihood based on those two aspects of these tiny statues. And now here is where you come in. Obviously the world of D&D is very large, and it's likely I missed a few things. So if there's anything that I missed, please include it in the comments below so others can peruse. If you wanted to see more of my character creation or world building videos, check out these playlists here. And in the words of another great D&D YouTuber, email this to your grandma. See you in the next one.